All right, today for our 15-minute version of utilitarianism. This one is very similar. It's coming chronologically after Immanuel Kant. Kant is writing in the Age of Enlightenment, and it goes from René Descartes to Immanuel Kant in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then as we enter into the 19th century, we're fully into the Age of Reason. We get Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who want to also have an ethical theory based entirely on reason, not on culture, not on God, not on what your mama said, but on reason. Jeremy Bentham, though, in formulating this theory, he said we have to acknowledge the underlying goal that drives human behavior. And he said this underlying motivating factor is pleasure. And if you remember back to when we did egoism and I threw out that bonus theory of hedonism, hedonism is the theory that pleasure is good and pain is evil. And so Jeremy Bentham has bought into this, and he believes all human endeavor and activity is a search to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And so in our use of reason, we want to try to achieve that. Unlike Kant, however, who is a deontological ethical theorist who believe we are to do what's right because it's right, not for hope of reward or fear of punishment, but we simply do what's right because it's the right thing to do. It has to do with intention over outcomes. Jeremy Bentham was completely the opposite, and this is one of probably the primary of the teleological ethical theories. And if you remember, teleological theories are looking for the end or the results of what happens. So it's also called consequentialism because the focus is on the consequence of the action is what's going to determine whether it was a good or evil, a right or wrong action. And so this is Jeremy Bentham's process. He's going to develop what's called, and there's two types of utilitarianism, and it's important to know the difference. He is going to develop what is called act-based utilitarianism. And the premise of this is we are to look for the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. Okay, one more time. The greatest good, good meaning happiness, for the greatest amount of people. Now you can see already how well this theory is going to work with a democratic society or a democratic republic like the United States, because now basically ethics and morality come down to a vote of the majority. And whatever the majority's will is, or what the majority thinks will bring them the most happiness, is what gets to be made into laws or to become the standards of right living. Another nice thing about this theory is it's flexible. Something may have been the right way to do things in the past and would have brought the most happiness, but now its opposite may be true. And so we're allowed to adjust our theory to the times. And if we find out that something isn't working, we're allowed to bring in new data, new information, and to form a new understanding of what we think will bring happiness. This theory is based on empiricism and reason. Empiricism is a fancy word for sense perception. So we're talking like science, data. It's like a data-driven ethical system. We want to bring in as much perspective and data points as we can so that we can predict what the future will hold. And so we want to pursue activities that we think will predict to lead to more happiness for more people, and we want to avoid people that will bring harm or suffering to ourselves or others. Okay. Unfortunately, some of the critiques of Jeremy Bentham's act-based utilitarianism were that, holy cow, you could justify anything, including rape, torture, murder, dropping thermonuclear warheads, if the end result was a greater benefit or happiness than greater suffering. And that did not sit well with his disciple and collaborator, John Stuart Mill. And so John Stuart Mill, in order to address some of the critiques against act-based utilitarianism, he developed what's called rule-based utilitarianism, where he says there's certain things, even if we think it might bring about greater good, we simply don't do them, like things like rape, torture, dropping thermonuclear warheads, because those are simply wrong in and of themselves. Even though they might potentially bring about good, from what we know in the past and history and observation is those usually always end out poorly for the most people. So in rule-based, there's certain off-limit activities, and then we make decisions based on what we think will produce the greatest outcomes. Now, real quickly, even though I'm not critiquing this theory right now, I'm just presenting it. My problem with that is, well, where are you getting those rules from? You have to get those from another theory outside of your own. Because if your theory is just saying the highest good is what's good for the greatest number of people, where do those qualifiers come from? And that would be my critique of that issue. Well, John Stuart Mill actually used his rule-based utilitarianism to decide whether or not he would marry. And the way he did this was he developed something called Hedonic Calculus. So it's basically the math of calculating what will produce the greatest pleasure. And this is the highest math I know, and it's kind of fun. And so I'm going to roll this out for you real quickly. And some of you may have already done something very similar to this to pick like what kind of car you would buy, what kind of chips you're going to get at the store, maybe even what college you went to, even down to who you will marry. And this is what John Stuart Mill did. He made this little chart with his different qualifiers, and then he gave point values to them, and then he added up the scores and decided whether or not he would marry. Now, I'm sorry I don't have a blackboard here. If you want to see me do this with the class, you can watch the full-length hour video I have posted on my Darkwater channel. But let me just read out this list. So the way I would do this, you could do this collectively as a group, like as a class or a nation, or you could do this individually for yourself. So it can work from an individual level to a small group level to a national or worldwide level. So if you number 1 to 7, and then you could give points for like pros or cons on the other side. So the first thing he asked is, how intense is the pleasure going to be? So on a scale of 1 to 10, and in this book I'm using, this is like an intro to philosophy book, he's got a pig down there, if you can see him wallowing in the mire. And if you imagine this pig going through this list of questions. So in this case, how intense would the pleasure of wallowing in the mud be? Secondly, duration. How long will this pleasure last? Duration. How long will this pleasure last? Certainty. How certain am I of this pleasure happening? Some pleasures are fairly certain, some may or may not happen. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain am I that this is going to be pleasurable? Fourth is proximity. How near in space or time is this pleasure? Do I have to wait a few months to get it? 10 years to get it? Do I have to walk 1,000 miles to get it? Or is it right outside my own back door? How near, how close in place and time is the pleasure? Fifthly, fecundity. I love this word. Think of fecund soil that grows sorts of things. So when we ask how fecund it is, we're asking how many more like pleasures will follow from this particular pleasure. And if a lot of pleasures will follow from this pleasure, that's a positive. If this is a one-time out pleasure, maybe not so great. 6, purity. How free from pain is this pleasure? Now, some pleasures are almost entirely devoid of pain. Other pleasures are incredibly commingled with pain. So he wants to know, how free from pain will this pleasure be? In his case, he was asking in the context of marriage, how free from pain will my marriage be? And he would score that on like a 1 to 10 scale. And then finally, This is the social aspect of this theory. Because unlike egoistic hedonism, where you're only concerned about your own pleasure, utilitarianism is also called social hedonism, where it's not just about your pleasure, but it's about the pleasure of the majority. And so there are cases where if you're a good utilitarian, you might actually be willing to forego your individual personal pleasure if many more people could get pleasure based on your suffering. You may be willing to do that. And so the extent, how many other people will find pleasure in what I'm about to do? And so Jeremy Bentham used this to determine whether or not he should marry. And when I teach this in a live class, and if I had a whiteboard, I would do it with you now, but I just simply poll the class and we do it as a group. I usually try to find someone that's engaged and have them be kind of like our base, and they have their own personal tally going, and then I have the class collectively rating each of these 7 criteria on a 1 to 10 scale. And so we could compare, if we did marriage, we could talk about how intense is the pleasure of marriage versus the intensity of the pleasure of being single, right? How long will the pleasure of marriage last compared to how long will the pleasure of being single last? How certain am I of the pleasure of marriage? How certain am I of the pleasure of singleness? How near is the prospect of getting married? How near is the prospect of being single? And you work down these things, and then it's simply like doing math. You add up the columns, you see which column has the most numbers, and that's how you make your decision. If things change in the future and it changes the numbers, you rerun the calculation. And if the numbers change, you choose a different course of action. Any questions or comments so far? Okay, well, I still got 3 minutes. So let me do a quick critique of this. As you can imagine, this is by far one of the most popular ethical theories in 21st century America. We are brought up from our kindergarten to adulthood thinking as utilitarians. What works best, costs cheapest, lasts longest. The ends justify the means, the least of 2 evils. You've heard people say these sorts of statements your whole life. This is coming out of a utilitarian worldview. And we use it, and we have used it as Americans to justify everything from the acquisition of territories which were not our own, to torture, to dropping thermonuclear warheads. It's a utilitarian justification. Yes, it's wrong to torture another human being, but if we can get information that could save tens of thousands of lives, that offense is justifiable. Yes, it's wrong to drop bombs on population centers, but if dropping those bombs can end the war more quickly and save millions of lives, it's justifiable and a moral thing to do. That is how utilitarian works. In the elections, how many times have you heard people say, I don't like either candidate, but I'm going to vote for the least of 2 evils? That is a utilitarian way of thinking, that I'm going to vote for the one who's going to bring the least amount of pain and suffering on the nation, at least according to my belief system. All right. Very interesting. And it's even like voting, right? We're used to voting for things, whether it's as a family, a class policy with our friends. Like if you're trying to decide between pepperoni and Italian sausage pizza, you simply do a vote. And if more people want pepperoni, you're eating pepperoni. Yeah, the 2 out of 10 people that wanted Italian sausage may not be happy, but 8 out of 10 are. And you're going for the majority happiness. Now, some of the problems, of course, is who gets to decide what's in our best interest? Because if we just leave it up to the mob is ignorant and will often choose immediate gratification that will result in long-term harm. And so you have to think in context of long-term consequences. It's also troubling that we don't know whether an action is good or evil until all the results are in. So it's kind of like we're flying blind. Another thing is, back to this idea of who gets to say what's most pleasurable. Well, if wallowing in a mud bath is what we're talking about, well, if you're a pig, you might score tens all the way down on how pleasurable that is. But if you're not a pig, wallowing in the mire might not even get a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 for you. So who is making these decisions? And the last thing would be some things we can't take back. So for example, we thought DDT was this wonderful insecticide where we could grow bumper crops, feed more people. But what we didn't realize was this wonderful dream insecticide that was allowing us to produce more food than ever before was seeping into our groundwater. And we began to notice that migratory fowl, they weren't able to bring their eggs to full term because the shells were thin. Later, we started to have birth defects in humans. And finally, the connection was made, but it was too late. We had already poisoned our groundwater. And it's taken decades in banning those sorts of pesticides or insecticides to begin to clear out our groundwater and remove some of those carcinogens and cancer-causing and mutant-causing agencies. And so that's troubling to think about. You may have thought you were making a good decision, but the jury's still out until all the dust settles. So there's your utilitarianism, consequentialism, in almost 15.